Hi, I'm Vivian Broughton. I'm a psychotrauma therapist and I'm doing a series of lectures which I'm going to put online on the topic of trauma and the topic of identity. The work that I do is called identity-oriented psychotrauma therapy, and I'm going to say a bit about what that is and where it comes from. And this presentation, particular presentation, is as if you perhaps don't know anything about this work. So it really is an overview and an introduction. In further presentations, I'm going to go into each of the topics more deeply. So this is a starter. So the therapy that I work with is called identity-oriented psychotrauma therapy, or it's called IOPT for short. It was developed by Professor Dr. Franz Rupert, who's a psychologist and psychotherapist at Munich University of Applied Sciences in Germany. He has spent the last 25 years studying and researching psychological and emotional trauma and bonding and attachment issues. So he got very interested, one of the things he got very interested in the early mid-1990s was the work of the British psychoanalyst John Bowlby and the development of attachment therapy that was developed later by others as well. He's developed a body of theory he calls identity-oriented psychotrauma therapy, and he also has developed a method of working with unresolved trauma, what he calls the intention method. He's the author of 8 books in German. 7 of these have been translated into English and published by Greenbloom Publishing, which is a partnership that I started up in order to publish books by Franz Rupert and by myself. He continues to lecture at university, and he runs his own seminar in practice in Munich, where he lives, and he travels extensively throughout the world teaching and presenting IOPT work. So that's a little biography of Franz Rupert. I'll just say something more about myself for those of you who don't know me. I trained as a psychotherapist, a Gestalt psychotherapist, in the late 1980s at a reputable institute in London. And I worked as a psychotherapist really up until about 2004, 2005, by which time I had met Professor Rupert and I had got very interested in the ideas that he was developing. And since that time, since 2005, I have studied and continue to study with him only, and I have worked according to his ideas and the method that he has developed entirely since 2010. I run a training in London where I teach professionals or people interested in into becoming practitioners of IOPT work. And I also go to other countries and teach on other education course programs. So, to continue, we're going to look first of all at what is trauma. Now, I wrote a book back in about 2013, 14, something like that, called The Heart of Things. And I wanted to take what Franz Rupert was developing and put it alongside other thinking about trauma, and also put it alongside an understanding of the history of development of trauma. And one of the there's 2 really interesting things that I found when I did that. One was that the whole psychotherapeutic endeavor that started in the mid-19th century, in the mid-1800s, in Paris, where Freud was a student with a whole range of other people, and all of these students were in fact studying trauma. They were studying, in fact, what was called at the time hysteria, which is a diagnosis that has been around since ancient Greek times. And what they realized was that hysteria was trauma. And so they started their starting point, in a way, was to understand how trauma worked and what it is, and how to work with people who were suffering from hysteria or trauma. The really interesting thing is that the study of trauma got lost. There's a writer in America called Professor Judith Herman who wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery, and she writes a very interesting first few chapters on the history of the study of trauma. So I'm not going to go into it too much, but suffice to say that when I trained as a psychotherapist in the late 1980s at a very reputable psychotherapy training institute, it still exists now, the word trauma was never used in my training. And in fact, the diagnosis that we most commonly hear of, post-traumatic stress disorder, only came into being in 1979. So we have lived it was over 100 years since this initial attempt to study trauma, and when we finally got a diagnosis that went into the American DSM, as it was then, 4, which is the manual of diagnostic categories for mental illness or disorder. And even now, DSM-5 in 2019, as far as I'm aware, that is still the only diagnostic category that uses the word trauma in its title. And I have to say that in my work with IOPT work and the clients that I see, and when I look at the DSM-5, I could put trauma in every single diagnostic category in the DSM-5 without any problem at all. So it's interesting to understand that the study of trauma got lost, really. And I think it was only after the Vietnam War, when the Vietnam veterans were so traumatized and so needing help, that we started to think about trauma again. And there were some very early people who thought about trauma at the time. Jonathan Shea is one who wrote 2 wonderful books based on the Greek stories of Oedipus and relating them to the homecoming of the Vietnam veterans. And also Bessel van der Kolk is another person who got very interested in the study of trauma around the time of the Vietnam veterans. Then, hot on the heels of the post-Vietnam troubles with the veterans, with the people coming home, we also started to deal with domestic violence. And the first domestic violence for women centres were started up. I think the first one was in Los Angeles and the second one was in London. And then from there, then we also started to what started to emerge was childhood sexual abuse and traumatization. And that became very, very prominent in the 90s and the early 2000s. So one of the things that was interesting for me when I wanted to do this book and to talk about Franz Rupert's work in relation to other work was that I couldn't find anywhere a definition of what trauma actually is. There were lots of ideas about trauma and thoughts about trauma and a lot of focus on post-traumatic symptomatologies that then, if a person had those, you might say that they were suffering from trauma, but no actually defined in a clear way what trauma is. So that's what I'm going to do to start with. So the first one is trauma is an experience that we do not have the emotional, psychological, and physical resources to manage and resolve. So we do not have the means to be able to manage it. That's the first bit I want to put across. The second is, and it's obvious from the previous one, we are completely helpless in the face of unstoppable forces, and the only option is to dissociate, freeze, and fragment. And we call this last item, fragmentation, we call it splitting. The concept of splitting is not new, but we are going to look at it in more detail. And the third one is psychologically and emotionally we split and render the unbearable experience into the unconscious. So that's an introductory statement. It's not a clear definition. So we're going to go on to a more clear definition here. So, bullet point 1, a situation that the individual is unable to manage with his current psychological and physical capacities and resources. So we've seen that from the previous slide. The experience is literally unbearable. The person cannot bear it in their body and their mind system. It's an experience of being utterly overwhelmed, utterly helpless, and in mortal danger, as if the experience is, I might die if I do not, if this continues. I fear for my life. The stress reactions, now this is a very interesting point because generally speaking, fight and flight are associated with trauma. But we make a distinction between high stress and trauma, and we say that they are completely different. And that the stress reactions, fight and flight, which are the ability to fight or the ability to run away, are insufficient and fail against the forces. Survival requires the psyche or the I, the subject, to split and relegate the experience to the unconscious. This process is beyond our control. We have no choice. It comes from the reptilian brain, which is the earliest brain, the primitive brain in all animal species. It's at the top of the spinal cord, underneath the limbic brain, and then the neocortex sits on top. But the reptilian brain deals with all sorts of reactions and impulses that are beyond our control. So like the startle reaction, that comes from the reptilian brain, and we don't have any choice over that. It's just there. So now we're going to look at high stress and trauma and understand the difference between these two things. A high stress situation forces a hypermobilized state in order to facilitate the stress response of fight and flight. In order to fight or to flee, we need a lot of energy. And so the high stress situation increases the heart rate, increases the breathing, releases a lot of stress hormones and activity hormones that will make us very energized. This is why in some situations you hear people doing things with superhuman strength. So it's a very active, mobilized state. This hypermobilized state, however, cannot be sustained for long. It puts too much stress on the body and on the mind. In a very physical sense, if the heart keeps going at that very accelerated rate, it will fail. Some people say it will explode with the effort. And so there comes also from the reptilian brain a cutout. And we have no choice over that either. If we do not cut out, if we do not, in a sense, we could say, go into the trauma state, we would die anyway. We would die from the hypermobilized state. So if the fight-flight reflex cannot resolve the situation, we have to go into a trauma state, which is a state of dissociation, freezing, and fragmentation. So if the situation is such that we cannot fight it, and we cannot run away, we are utterly trapped, we are utterly helpless, then we go into the trauma state. This is a reaction, again, from the primitive reptilian brain and is beyond our control. The principal trauma survival strategy is dissociation, which is a kind of psychological and emotional distancing from the current reality. It's like going a bit spacey. And then that's followed by splitting. So we dissociate from the event and then we split it off. And the splitting is a more structural process. When we split our psyche, we lose our identity, our sense of self, our integrity. Now, this is an important point because we're going to also look further in the lecture and in the series at what we mean by identity. But one of the first things to understand is that when we split our psyche is not whole, it's not integrated anymore. And in some sense, we have split part of ourselves off into our unconscious, and that means that we do not have our full identity, our full sense of self. Our full sense of self is not integral anymore, and we have lost, in some sense, our integrity. So I've got a drawing here, which I'd like to show you. So if I use the pointer, I can say, okay, so this is a stress level bar, and this is a time level bar. And this line here is an increase in stress. Now, one of the things that's important to remember is that activity is a stress. Even a pleasant activity like giving a party or going out with a friend or something like that. This is a stress. What we mean by that is it requires the body to produce hormones for activity. It's an activity, but it's it's just every day. It's what we do every day. So this is a mobilization of stress. So in the normal way, this comes up, we get a stressful situation, and then it comes back down again, or we put it down that way. So we can recover from that. Now, if we get up into the high stress area, we have our fight and flight response, which starts to kick in as we move towards a high stress area. So maybe I'm having a confrontation with my boss and I'm frightened that I'm going to get the sack or something like that. And my stress gets really high, and I start to wonder whether I should fight with him about it, whether I should challenge him on it, or whether I should just leave the room. This is, we could probably say, a mildish version of fight or flight. I'm in a situation I don't want to be in. The options are, do I stay and fight it, or do I walk away? Now, as we go on, we get up to the really high stress, which would be something, where actually my life is in danger, real danger, like an assault or something like that, a rape or something like that. Then fight or flight is an emergency, an absolute emergency. And if I can't do that, I reach a tipping point here. And at that tipping point, I'm into the trauma down here and freeze and fragment. Now, the trauma then is like we know that animals, if they can't get away, will play dead. They will go into a slightly catatonic state. And of course, for animals, that could save their life, because the predator animal, often they don't eat dead meat, so they want their prey to be alive. And another situation is where an animal will leave the prey and go off to get their young to bring them back to eat the prey, and that gives the prey an opportunity to save themselves. So they go into this slightly catatonic state of what we call playing dead. If you haven't read the work of Peter Levine, particularly Waking the Tiger, which I think was one of either his first book or certainly a very early book, where he talks a lot about trauma as it relates to animals and how they deal with it. But I'm going to talk more about that a bit later as well. So again, to looking at high stress and trauma, we understand high stress leads to a hypermobilized state, a very energized state, and trauma leads to a hypomobilized state. We can regain our equilibrium from high stress. We can slide back down that curve and maintain our homeostatic, equal peaceful state, if you like. But we cannot regain our equilibrium from trauma. If you remember the graph like this, once we're down here, we cannot go back up and down the curve, the previous curve. Trauma cannot be reversed. Once psychological splitting has occurred, it remains in place. Now, I just need to say a couple of words about this. When we say it cannot be reversed, it has happened. We have passed the tipping point. We have split. And that is quite a structured issue, the splitting off. It's quite a structured issue. And we cannot reverse that on our own. Now, of course, one of the things I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to do a whole lecture on it, is healing trauma. And we have to think carefully what we mean by healing trauma or resolving trauma. Trauma happened. We cannot make it as if it didn't happen. But we can, I believe very strongly, work with our trauma to make it so that it doesn't impinge on our lives in the way that it normally does, in terms of the fact that we're so split. So we can reduce that. But I'm going to talk about that later. Okay. So this is Rupert's basic model of psychological splits caused by trauma. So what we see here is the trauma coming in. This section here is what we call our healthy part, our healthy I. Before the trauma, the whole circle was a healthy I. But we're showing here the splits that happen after trauma. So this little green face down here represents our healthy ability. And we all know this experience of being in our healthy self. We feel good about ourselves. We feel in control of what's happening. Our interactions with others are responsive, not reactive. We can make clear decisions. We can think clearly about situations. We can work through problems in a clear way. That is when we're in our healthy self. Now up here, then, what we have is the split off trauma. And there may be many of these if we have experienced many traumas. This is why we call it the trauma parts. Now these are the experiences and the emotions of the trauma moment that we have split off into a separate part of the psyche. So we have here, we have the boundary between the healthy part and the traumatized parts. Then we have this new part here, the surviving part. This is new. This is a part of ourselves that the only function of this part of ourselves is to hold the boundaries, is to keep the trauma, is to keep these boundaries here so that this stays unconscious. And in the beginning, the surviving strategies actually that save our life, that's a really important part of it, are dissociation and the setting up of the split. But in the weeks, months, years even that follow, the survival part of ourselves develops all sorts of strategies, some of which are very subtle, very sophisticated even, that maintain this boundary. So that we can, in fact, think of many things that we do in our lives on a daily basis and consider whether these are actually things that we are doing to keep these painful experiences out of consciousness. This and in conventional psychotherapy, what we call this part, the surviving self, has often been called resistance, because it is very resistant to healing. But for us to call it the survival self or the survival part really indicates that in the moment when this part gets active, somewhere in us we feel like we are in a situation that we actually may not survive. So the original trauma moment gets replayed maybe several times during a day when we go into a place where we actually feel my life is under threat. It may not reach a full neocortex consciousness, but it's in our body. It's something happens in our body. And we don't call this resistance to healing because we recognize that this issue of being in the trauma is here and now, all the time, potentially, if something triggers. Something might happen in my environment, someone might say something, and this gets a little triggered, and this part then gets busy to try and hold the boundary. And the thing also to remember is that if we didn't have this surviving part on a daily basis, our healthy self would be flooded by the trauma feelings and we couldn't function. So we need this, but at the same time, it also becomes very restricting of us and actually can even become dangerous to us. So extreme kinds of survival strategies, for example, are addictions, ways of not feeling the pain. But that's along the continuum. There's a vast continuum of surviving strategies, and down at the more severe end are addictions, things like anorexia, eating disorders, things like suicide attempts. I mean, in a way, the ultimate survival strategy is to commit suicide so as not to feel the pain. But there's a whole range up this end of the continuum that are more kind of everyday activities, the ways in which I distract myself if something triggers my trauma. So I'm going to go on to talk about types of trauma, and the first categorization is a distinction between natural traumas, i.e. earthquakes, tsunamis, cyclones, mudslides, things like this that upset our lives but are to do with nature. Relational trauma is a situation where one member of a species traumatizes another member of the same species. So all relational trauma involves a perpetrator and a victim. A perpetrator is someone who causes psychological and emotional and physical harm to another, and a victim is someone who is harmed by another to the point of being traumatized. So we're going to look in more detail at the split parts. The healthy I is still available when we feel safe. So when we feel okay and safe and there's no conflict or anything, then we're in our healthy self and everything is fine. And when we're in our healthy self, we can make good decisions, we can think clearly, we can relate to other people clearly, and sign documents, whatever we want to do. We know what we're doing when we're in our healthy I. The trauma parts are always the age of the trauma and hold the unbearable frozen in time experiences and emotions. So one of the things that we make central to our work, which I will go into further later, is the fact that the most formative traumas happen very early in our life, even pre-birth, in the mother's womb. So therefore, the traumatized parts of ourselves are always very young. And so we could say that if something happens in your day and you start to feel like a child, your trauma has been re-triggered. So this could be useful information for you. The survival part's only function is to maintain the split, to protect the healthy I from being overwhelmed by the trauma experiences and the emotions. So we couldn't, as I said before, we couldn't function on a daily basis without our survival part. But at the same time, it doesn't have much thinking ability, it's very reactive, and its only interest really is in keeping the trauma out of consciousness. So we look at a little bit more. It's a healthy aspiration to heal ourselves. So that comes from the healthy I, is this idea, this impulse, I want to heal myself. The traumatized parts want to be allowed to exist, to be seen, and to be allowed to express what has been cut off and been frozen, the trauma experience, so that it can be relieved. The survival part's job, however, is to keep these two away from each other, to maintain the split. Now we can see here that the healthy aspiration and the traumatized part's aspiration are similar. They want, in certain ways, the same thing, but the survival part does not want that. So there's always an inner conflict. And one of the things I realized when I got very involved in this work was that as a conventional psychotherapist, when I was working with clients one-to-one, one of the things I realized was that everybody goes into therapy in a conflicted state. There's a part of us that really wants change. So most people go into therapy because their lives are not working very well. And so they want something to change. But at the same time, there's a part of them which I now see as the survival part's job, which says, whoa, this is too much. I don't want to go there. This feels too scary. And so there's a conflict between these two impulses within us. However, the survival part, the existence of this resistance, as we used to call it in psychotherapy, and I now call it the survival part, is useful because it also protects us of going into territory that is too much for us, where we would then again feel utterly helpless, and it would be a re-traumatization. So in a way, the survival part holds a moderating influence on the possibility of healing at any moment. And this is a very interesting tension, if you like, between the aspiration to heal and understanding that there is a part of us that will protect us from going too far, too quickly, too soon. And we always say that healing trauma is really a step-by-step process. You cannot do it all at once. You literally cannot, because your own survival self will interrupt and say, no, this is enough. So it has a useful part, a useful function in that way. Characteristics of a healthy part. So this a PDF of this presentation is going to be on my website, and you may even have it before you see this presentation. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are all things that you probably would also be able to say would be the characteristics of when you feel okay in yourself. Capable of being self-responsible, seeks clarity and truth. Trauma is so much to do with not truth, with lies and illusions and delusions and stories, to make the whole experience not so unbearable. Has basic confidence, can make good contact with other people, has a capacity for genuine empathy rather than a pseudo-empathy. All of these things are the characteristics of the healthy I. Sexual desire and behavior is appropriate. We'll be looking more at sexuality in another presentation as well. Characteristics of the traumatized part. Stores the memory of the trauma. Stores the emotions and experiences of the trauma. We've seen that. Is always the same age as when the trauma occurred. Is continually engaged with the traumatic experience and can unpredictably and suddenly be re-triggered. Characteristics of the survival part. Constructs and guards the split, denies and suppresses the trauma experience, develops avoidant behavior to avoid it, develops controlling behavior, controlling myself and controlling others, develops compensating behavior like drugs, alcohol, eating disorders. These are complex because they're ways of not feeling the pain, the emotional pain. But also, if we have to suppress a large part of ourselves because in the splitting process, because it's painful, we are also having to suppress our ability to feel pleasure and happiness and joy. And so we may go for drugs and alcohol as compensation for this. Eating disorders are a form of controlling ourselves, controlling the environment. The trauma survival part fosters illusions, lies and misinformation as a way of dealing with the trauma. So saying, oh, it wasn't so bad, it was just this, I dealt with it okay. These kinds of ways of thinking about it are not real in relation to the reality of the situation. And it also produces new splits if necessary to maintain the suppression of the trauma. So what happens is if a re-triggering of the trauma is so strong that the survival strategies that I have developed are insufficient to keep the trauma out of consciousness, the psyche will split again. The survival self will force the psyche to split again. And so we may end up with many splits in our psyche, many different parts of ourselves. A very simple way of understanding this partition process is if we're confronted with something and we feel split about it. So we may say, for example, well, part of me feels this and part of me feels that. This is the language of the survival self. Because if we were in our healthy self, we would be able to see the situation clearly enough to make a clear decision. This is the theory that we're working with. So now we're going to go down a little further into relational trauma and look at the primary types of relational trauma that get repeated throughout our lives. So the first one that we have is existential trauma. So existential trauma is a situation where my life is really threatened by an accident, assault, torture, by operations, rape, something like that. It's a real existential, physical trauma that we might not survive. Then we start on a series of 3 traumas that are usually happen when we're young, even very young, and that come out of the notion of, from attachment theory, of attachment trauma. So we see attachment trauma as being more complex than just saying attachment trauma. And incidentally, most attachment theory and thinking is looking at children at certainly post-birth, around the age of a year, 18 months to 2 years old. We are looking at much earlier. We are looking at the earliest time of our life, from the moment of conception, when the egg and the sperm come together and the unique being that you are is created. It's interesting to me that we all celebrate our birthday, but we don't celebrate our conception day, as if that 9 months didn't exist as a life, as if we weren't alive until we come out of our mother's vagina, or how we come out of our mother's belly, however that is, because it might be cesarean. So the first one of these is the trauma of identity, and this is the inability to hold on to one's identity, and it comes from the experience of not being wanted by my mother. Now, I think that this trauma, the trauma of identity, primarily happens in the moment when the mother finds out that she's pregnant. So the child in the mother's womb may be only a few weeks old. And it comes from the mother's reaction to understanding that she's pregnant, whether her reaction is one of a wholehearted yes to this child, to whatever this child will become, to the unique individuality of this child, whoever he or she may be, whether her reaction to the child is yes, you are you, and you will be whoever you will be, or whether her reaction is ambivalent. Oh, I'm not sure I want to be pregnant. I'm frightened. It's not a very good time. I'm not sure who the father is, or we don't have a lot of money. All sorts of, a whole range of issues that may immediately come up for the mother when she knows she's pregnant. And it may mean that she is not sure about being pregnant. And the other category is one where she has a resounding no to this child. No, I do not want to be pregnant. No, I do not want to have a child. No, I may even think, she may even think about abortion, and she may even make an attempt at abortion. All of these are a trauma for the child. There's another category of unwantedness, and that is where the mother wants the child for her own purposes. So it's very common for people to say, that they have ended up mothering their mother. So the mother, unconsciously, it's unconscious in her, she's looking for a mother, probably because of her own trauma of identity with her mother. So she looks for the child. Oh, this child will be a mother to me, or this child will do this for me, or this child will take care of my husband, or this child will look after me when I'm old, or this child will be a doctor or a lawyer, or make us proud, bring kudos to the family. These are all attributions that the mother puts on the child, but the underlying issue for the child is that they are not wanted for who they uniquely are. And this is a trauma of identity, and it's a trauma for the child, because the child in the mother's womb is utterly, utterly dependent on the mother. Physically, the child is not separate from the mother. There's the umbilical cord that goes with the mother. And the child is attached to the mother physically, emotionally, and psychologically. And all of these issues have an impact on the child. Then, fast on the heels of the trauma of identity comes the trauma of love, which is the child's inability to establish a loving connection with the mother, or the experience of being unloved. And we can see, actually, that if the child is not wanted, then they cannot be loved. So the trauma of love comes as part of, it comes immediately on the heels of the trauma of identity, the trauma of not being loved. And after that comes the trauma of sexuality, or the trauma of not being protected, because I also put violence in here. Being exposed to confused sensual and sexual contact, being unprotected. Now, if the child's not wanted and the child's not loved, then in some level the mother doesn't really care enough and possibly will not see situations where the child is in danger. And the final one we have here is the trauma of becoming a perpetrator myself. Becoming a perpetrator is a survival strategy. So a very common survival strategy is to control myself, is to become a perpetrator to myself. But then there is also the trauma of becoming a perpetrator to another person. The first time that we, for instance, at school become a bully. This in itself is also traumatizing to the perpetrator in that moment. We're going to look a lot more at perpetrator-victim dynamics. I'm going to do a whole presentation on it, because it's an extremely important part of the whole thing. I mean, trauma is, relational trauma is an event where there is a perpetrator and a victim, as we have seen, where someone perpetrates against another. These early traumas define our life. It's important to understand that all later traumas always re-trigger these primary life-defining events. So if when I'm a teenager I'm assaulted in the street by a gang, for instance, and I fear for my life, that is a trauma. But within the experience of that trauma is also these earlier traumas. And these earlier traumas and how well we have been able to manage them have a direct impact on how we can manage the later trauma. One of the things in the trauma field that people are sometimes puzzled about is why two people faced with exactly the same situation, let's say assault and rape, have widely varying reactions. One person may be able to manage it reasonably well, and another person will be totally devastated and totally undermined by it. And those two differing reactions are due to the impact of the earlier traumas, which are always re-triggered in the later event. And then comes, it's logical, the next point is to try to heal and resolve the later trauma without addressing the earlier cannot ultimately be effective. It will be effective to a degree, but it cannot be fully effective if we don't go back to the first traumas. So I'm going to look now a little bit in detail at the primary strategies of trauma survival, how we manage these these traumas. So the first thing to understand is all traumas, whether they're early or later in life, um, stimulate dissociation, followed by splitting, numbing of the body, very often different parts of the body, and denial. In a way, when we talk about splitting, one of the primary splits we do is here, is between our neocortex and our ability to think and rationalize about things and the experience in our body. And so we often are very split off from our physicality. Trauma of identity. The primary trauma strategy of the trauma of identity is to identify with the mother's wants and attributions. So if our own ability to hold on to our identity is not viable in the situation, the only option we have is to identify with my mother and her wants and her ideas about me. So if the idea is of the mother's is, oh, this child will look after me in my old age, then this is an attribution, and we will identify with that and dutifully do it. Many of us do. I mean, when I say looking, of course, in the real world, this is what we do. We do look after our parents in old age, but we do it in a practical, rational, open-hearted way. But many of the times we do it in a compulsive, slavish, I would even say, way, that we are her slave, if you like. That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that before, but it has that feel about it. The trauma of love, the way we survive that is we develop delusional ideas about love. One day my mother will love me. Money can buy love. And we see our delusional ideas about love everywhere in our current society, westernized societies, where love is used to sell things, it's used as a commodity. We see films where the protagonists, end of the movie, come together in this wonderful way. We've made it. It's all going to be okay, and we don't see the next 30 years of their lives together. This is all idealized love. Falling in love, really, I bet every one of us has had this crazy experience of falling in love. It's really a crazy experience. And do we idealize this other person. We really only see this other person in one way, a really idealized way. This is to do with the trauma of love. Trauma of sexuality. Again, we create delusions about sex, and again, we can see in our westernized societies, we use sex in all sorts of ways. We make a commodity of it. We use it as a substitute for love. We enact sex in an objectifying way, objectifying the other person, and we use sex as a perpetration. And then the trauma of becoming a perpetrator, the survival strategy of that is to say, I'm the victim, not this other person. I'm the victim. This person hurt me, therefore I have to hurt them. And this leads to a dynamic, a cycle that just continues and continues and continues, and everyone becomes perpetrator and victim to each other. And it's really hard to step out of, but we're going to have a more detailed look at that later on. So Franz Rupert has come up with this notion of our trauma biography, which has all these traumas, starting down here with the trauma of identity, followed by the trauma of love. And in this mix are any early existential traumas, and we're going to look at those in another presentation as well. But, for example, cesarean section is likely to be traumatizing for the child. The child has to give up on their natural impulse to birth themselves in an intimate relationship with the mother. Any invasive surgery that happens when the baby's in the womb or very young, immediately after birth, if they have to be put into an incubator or put on life support system, even if it's to save the child's life, it can still be an experience of existential trauma. Then we have the trauma of sexuality, and up the top here we have the trauma of becoming a perpetrator. And the arrows indicate the growing up of the person and the relationship of the traumas to each other. And the idea of this trauma biography is that we live from this trauma biography every moment of our lives. Every moment that we live, every interaction that we have is a potential re-stimulation of our trauma. It's really important that we start to understand this. So we need to look at trauma healing. It's no good if we talk all about this and we know about trauma if we don't also look at the possibilities of healing. Now, generally speaking, current thinking about trauma work falls into two categories. One category is managing the results or the symptoms of trauma, helping people to manage and avoid their frightening feelings, which in effect is strengthening the survival strategies. Now, an awful lot of trauma therapy does this, and it's helpful, of course, but it strengthens the survival strategies. It doesn't do anything to resolve the trauma. The second way, which is more where we sit, is finding ways of coming into direct contact with the frozen, split-off experiences and allowing the emotional expression. This requires safety and a sensitive process where the client is in charge of how far they go in any one session, and the therapist really understands the subtle dynamics of trauma and perpetrator-victim dynamics. Now, this is extremely important, this last bit. If we understand that trauma is a situation where we're utterly helpless, if we feel helpless in the therapy session, we're subject to re-traumatization. Therefore, the power issue, we can see, for example, that trauma is about power. If there's a perpetrator and a victim, the perpetrator is the powerful one and the victim is the one with no power. And the thing we don't want to do in the healing environment is replicate that in any way. And that has huge implications for how the therapist works, that the client must be in charge, and how the therapist holds themselves in relation to the client, and how they perhaps make interventions that hopefully will be helpful to the client is a huge topic, because as soon as the therapist does anything that skews this balance of power, we're moving into the territory where the person may get unhelpfully re-traumatized. So trauma healing means the first step of trauma healing is to understand or recognize I am traumatized. So, for example, I could say to you, if you have moments in your life when you do not feel in control, when you do something and you think afterwards, where did that come from? Or you lose it, if you like. Maybe you're driving and someone cuts you up and you lose it. I would propose to you that you consider that you are somewhere in you holding unresolved trauma. So the first step, and I haven't even written it here, is to think about the fact, am I actually carrying trauma? The second step is, if I think I am, is to take it seriously. And that means doing something about it. And it requires will and commitment. And this is a challenge in a way, because if I have suffered a trauma of identity, my will and my commitment to myself have already been compromised. So that already creates a challenge for me to gather up the will and the commitment to myself to do something about it. Because one of the things we have to realize about those early traumas is we were not shown commitment to us. Nobody took us seriously. So it requires will and commitment. And the next step is starting to recognize my survival strategies. Now, I wrote a little book which I affectionately call the Rainbow Book. And in that, one of the things I wanted to put forward in that book was things that people could do for themselves. I think that ultimately, in order to resolve trauma, we have to do that with a therapist who understands trauma in the way that I'm talking about. And the reason is because otherwise we just keep interrupting ourselves with our survival strategies. But what we can do is start to recognize the things that I do on a daily basis that are in fact ways of keeping me from my pain. My encouragement to you is to start to do that, is to start to think about things that you are doing every day and ask the question, am I avoiding something when I do this, or am I just doing this because that's what I want to do? So, for example, watching television. It's a pleasurable activity. But if I'm watching television or gaming or fiddling around on the computer or going to sleep or anything like that for a reason to avoid something in myself, then I'm using it as a survival strategy. So you can do that yourself. So trauma healing then means strengthening my healthy nature. And the thing is, the more you become aware of your survival strategies, of how that works, you are actually already strengthening your healthy nature. Becoming more self-aware is a strengthening of your healthy I. There it is, just to remind you, the icon that we use. So what we could say is that the more you recognize what this one is doing, this space, if you like, gets bigger and your healthy nature gets stronger. By doing that, you are coming into better contact with yourself. And when you are coming into better contact with yourself, we say in the work that we do, you cannot come into contact with the trauma until you are in contact with a healthy I. And we can see how that works in the work in another presentation. But when you are stronger in your healthy self and you're in better contact with yourself, you can then come into contact with your traumatized parts, and then you can allow yourself to feel the emotions that have been split off. This is what we call resolving trauma, all of these steps. So we have the method that Franz devised, the intention method, and I'm just going to very briefly give you an idea of how this works. It's a method of exploration. So what we're talking about is the person who's going to do a piece of work is setting off on a journey of exploration of the state of their psyche, the state of themselves. It's an opportunity. It's a process whereby the client maintains control of what happens and how far the exploration goes. So the client controls who they talk to, how they do it, and they can also say, this is enough, I can't do any more. They're in control of that. It's really important. The client also decides what is true and real and what is not. The primary meaning maker of the exploration is the person whose work it is. This is so different from going right back to the origins of psychotherapy, to psychoanalysis, where the analyst was the authority on who you are, was the meaning maker for you. This is a complete reversal of that. We now understand the client must be the person who makes the meaning, and in effect, we could say the client is the only person really who knows what's going on inside them. The therapist does not. The therapist is there to provide a means for the person to explore themselves and to understand themselves better. The work is with the psyche and the body together. So we, in the constellations process that we use, for any of you who know family constellations, we have borrowed the actual process in the intention method of the constellation. So what this means is that we are not sitting, so we are up and moving around, which means already we're more in our body. And of course, we know that trauma is not just a psychological concept. It's not just a splitting in the psyche. The psyche is throughout the body. So there's another very interesting presentation I'm going to do on what is the psyche. because I haven't seen anybody talking clearly about what we mean by the psyche. And Franz Rupert has come up with a very clear exposition on what the psyche is. And the psyche is throughout the body. There is no separation. This mind-body split is not real. So the work must then involve the psyche and the body together, of course. And the method provides then access to unconscious, pre-memory, pre-verbal and intrauterine information. So it provides us with a means to go right back, if we like, to the beginning and find out what happened, come into contact with the identity trauma that we suffered, most likely in the womb. And it's a method that starts with an intention devised by the client. Now, the word intention, it's a really important word because it's not just an idea. An intention is not just a conceptual idea. It involves action. If I say I have an intention to do something. So the word intention involves energy, it involves commitment, and it involves some kind of action. So I am as a client, I am the author and the authority of my process, my work. Here's an example of an intention. It's written on the board, so the person comes up with an intention. We have a restriction on the number of words or elements you can have in your intention. There's a very good reason for that. If we understand that trauma is about being overwhelmed, we want the process of the exploration not to be one that is likely to be overwhelming. And if we have 20 words, 20 elements, and we have 20 people representing these elements in the room, it's very likely there's an excess of information and it becomes overwhelming. So we make a restriction. Currently the restriction we have is five elements. Each of these words is an element, so we actually have 6 here, but that was back in a time when we had a limit of 7. So each of these words, I and want and to and feel and myself and the little full stop here, are what we call elements, and each of these will be represented. So if we're working in a group, at this point the person would choose people from the group to represent one of these elements. So choose one person to represent the word I, one person to represent the word want, and so on, and one person to represent the full stop. And then we start the process and we see what the experiences are of these people as they resonate with the word. I'm not going to talk more about it now, but suffice to say that, for example, the word want, we all have an agreed understanding. We could probably all in a room say what we understand by the word want, and we'd come to a consensual idea of what the word want means. But in the unconscious of the person whose work it is, this word want may be very different. One example is, if I have a trauma of identity and I have had to give up on my wants and identify with the wants of my mother, the word want in the process that we see may look very like my mother and not myself, and may have very little connection with me, and we may see it, I don't have ownership of my wants. So each of these words, I like to think of it as they provide a drop down, or they provide a thread down into the unconscious of the person as to what this word means in this particular context to this person. So this is just an example. And I'm going to end the presentation here. I think my next slide is literature. So these are books by Franz Rupert and some books by me. This is the little book that I was talking about, what I affectionately call the Rainbow Book. It's only 85 pages and it's got little drawings and cartoons in it. And most of the material that's in this presentation is in this book. If you go to my website, I should have put it up here. It's www.vivianbroughton.com, or if you put my name into Google, you'll find my website. You can find a contact form. If you have anything you want to ask me, you can email me and I will answer as best I can. And I will be putting up more presentations like this, so you can subscribe to my channel. I think that's how it works, and perhaps I'll see you on another one of my presentations. Great.